If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to like and or subscribe.
Well, today's readings seem to be making the point that those who are not against us are for us. See, Moses had brought God's people out of Egypt, out of slavery. But it wasn't long before they began to whinge, complain, when they were out there in the wilderness. They had been freed from slavery, but they still thought like slaves. They didn't take responsibility for themselves. They expected everything to be provided. So if anything went wrong, it was Moses' fault. So Moses collected 70 leaders together, or he called 70 leaders, outside of the camp. But it seemed that only 68 turned up, and 2 stayed in the camp. Moses' intention was to delegate some of the leadership tasks to them and to call down God's blessings on them. Well, God's Spirit comes to them, including the 2 who stayed inside the camp. Well, Joshua's not very happy about this, but Moses wisely says that God's blessings are given by him to whom, when, and where he wills. And then in the time of Jesus, it was common for pagans to perform exorcisms, often doing so in the name of some powerful person. In other words, they were freeloading on somebody else's authority. And it seems that the Jewish exorcists were using Jesus' name to drive out evil. And this time it was the Apostle John who wasn't very happy about this. John was distinguishing between insiders and outsiders. But Jesus doesn't condone that. Because if good comes from someone using Jesus' name, the one who invokes Jesus won't condemn him. So Jesus was not in favor of what we might call closed-shop spirituality. He says anyone, believers or not, who show compassion to one of his disciples will be rewarded. And anyone who causes one of his disciples to be led astray from true discipleship will be punished. And that punishment will be worse than punishment of death by drowning, which was one of the forms of capital punishment used by the Romans. And so there's a strong warning here to those Christian disciples who believe that they and they alone are the true believers, because they're in danger of becoming outsiders by their treatment of other believers or through their being self-indulgent. But we have to be careful. Jesus is not saying that we must accept everyone, whatever they believe, teach, or live. He is not saying that we must be tolerant of false teaching in the church or accepting behavior that is contrary to God's teaching. What he is saying is that God's love and spirit are not restricted in the ways that we may think they ought to be. And what disciples must do is ensure that we follow Jesus and be prepared to cut off anything or anyone that causes us to stray from the way of Christ. In Jesus' time, and even now in some countries ruled by Sharia law, amputation of hand, foot, or even eyes are punishment for some offences. Now, we may think this is pretty horrendous, but those punishments are considered to be more merciful than imposing a death sentence. And this is perhaps why Jesus says it is better to enter eternal life crippled than not at all. So opponents of the gospel are warned that the punishment that awaits them is worse than the loss of life. Jesus, in the translation we heard, talked about the fires of hell, but the Greek talks about Gehenna, the fires of Gehenna. Now, Gehenna was a valley outside Jerusalem where human sacrifices were once offered to the pagan god Moloch. And when that practice stopped, the valley became a rubbish dump where fires burned continually. So disowning one's life and cutting out what causes us to sin is the only way to find eternal life. The opposite of finding eternal life is not so much eternal punishment in the fires of hell, but to cease to exist, to be cut off from God. It is the fires of Gehenna that continue. People in there are just part of the rubbish. Now, Jesus was very aware of the spiritual war between good and evil, between serving self and serving our own interests, and serving God and the good of others. Now, the age in which we live is quite like that. It has a lot of similarities to that world. It's a world which is multicultural, multi-religious, and increasingly pagan. The church has little power or influence over the state and is no longer treated with respect by the majority of people. Western governments embrace a culture of death by passing legislation which devalues life. So the predominant ethic of our time is to serve self, no matter what the consequence for others and society at large might be. Well, it was in that culture that the first Christians had to learn how to live without power, yet to remain faithful to the teachings of Jesus. How they lived was in stark contrast to the world's norms, and they suffered for it. And it's the same for the church in our current age. Those who are not for us are against us. So let us be beacons of light, so that those who are not against us might be more fully with us.
If you've enjoyed this video, it would help us out greatly if you could like and or subscribe. Thank you.